Bon, merci. Merci pour l'invitation, François et Emmanuel. I will actually be maybe looping back through some of those materials, so I think it also constitutes the ground for hopefully a kind of expansive conversation that will continue to evolve over the 2 days. And it's great also to see the posters by the students and to see how the ideas of this colloquium are being kind of refracted through their own particular research and aesthetic practices. So I'm going to begin with a quote. The guy that was running forward, he's missing his right leg. And I watched this guy bleed out. I mean, the blood is hot. As the man died, his body grew cold, and his thermal image changed until he became the same color as the ground. I can see every little pixel if I just close my eyes. This literally chilling account of the chromatic transformation of a thermal image in the aftermath of a US drone strike over Afghanistan was recounted by Brandon Bryant, a former Air Force drone pilot who has since become an outspoken critic of the US-led war on terror. As the heat signature of Bryant's target cooled, his victim's body quickly becomes an indistinguishable field of monochromatic pixels that convert figure into ground. In this transition from hot data subject to cool data cache, the distinction between image and event fully merge. Different ontological realms are remediated, such that the on-screen dynamism of a wounded running man is converted into the pure electronic stasis of the screen. While the material violence of the event, a Hellfire missile strike conducted via satellite link between Nevada and Afghanistan, was already subsumed into the visual economy of the image as a transaction conducted between sensors and screens, Bryant's harrowing description of his remote but intimate televisual assassination emphasizes the degree to which the conflict zone has migrated to the operations of the screen. Yet this is not the public interface of broadcast television that mediates and transmits conflict as nightly news and sound bites, but the informatic screen of conflict pixels, a private screen event conducted between code and combatants. Many of our current conflicts are characterized by highly decentralized and diffuse networks as migrants flee the shifting war zones of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, or counterterrorism measures recede into the opaque spaces of black ops and secret detentions. This condition of spatial indeterminacy, in combination with distributed modes of open source and participatory journalism, including video activism, grassroots media, as well as online platforms and remote sensing capacities such as Google Earth, have rendered the geometric necessity of locating the professional journalist within the fixed spatial coordinates of a single location somewhat obsolete. Screens and software now provide a crucial portal into current events, as well as innovative tools for investigative work. But computational space has, of course, also been central to the production of violations, as practices of data acquisition and digital targeting transform subjects into patterns and data sets that are actionable and even executable. Despite the pixel memory that re-renders the event each time Bryant, who suffers PTSD, closes his eyes, the killing he both perpetuated and witnessed quickly dissolved into the field of digital abstraction, where the war on terror has found its most calculated political ally, namely in big data and machine learning algorithms. During the Obama administration, the now banned practice of signature strikes based upon pattern of life analysis took the drone war to new levels as the kill list expanded exponentially by means of data analytics. Under this practice, suspected militants could be legally terminated, not on the basis of their actions, but rather via their informatic correspondence with a pre-established data mesh. Likewise, the victims of drone strikes are represented almost exclusively through the metrics of casualty lists in the form of graphs and stats. While some of this has to do with the challenge of on-the-ground documentation in regions such as Waziristan, Afghanistan, and Yemen, where much of the drone war is taking place, it is also a consequence of the recourse to data abstractions that help to sever the effective bond between the victims of violence and a public whose opinions might waver if confronted with the visceral aftermath of such military technology exerted upon what are all too often civilian lives. However, the representation and disclosure of suffering is by no means contracted to this public sphere as a call to action or prompt for humanitarian intervention. Indeed, the live coverage of the genocidal violence that swept through Bosnia in the mid-1990s designates an infamous shift in screen theory as images brokered new alliances with perpetrators who committed atrocities in full view of TV cameras and crews, or indeed expressly for such cameras, a shift identified and discussed by media theorist Thomas Keenan in his well-known essay, Mobilizing Shame. Today we are witness to an even greater surge of images, still and moving, uploaded and streaming, that clearly depict self-evident violations of human rights or brutality towards unarmed citizens on the part of the state, but whose rhetorical capacity to convict legally has likewise failed miserably. Despite the demand for justice that such documentary images may perform publicly, when they enter into institutional infrastructures, especially legal, they cannot guarantee that the regime of representation will be adequate to the task of providing accountability or indeed result in a criminal conviction. A significant benchmark case in point is that of Rodney King, which was also recently discussed by Thomas Keenan at Goldsmiths, in which amateur camcorder footage documenting his roadside beating by the LAPD was re-edited when it was entered into court to downplay the racialized violence directed towards King, while intensifying the black menace of his body as a confrontational form in which violence was naturally inscribed. I'll just play a few seconds of that. I'll continue to run that clip in the back without the sound. I apologize for that. The vicious assault towards King, an African-American motorist stopped during a routine traffic check on March 3rd, 1991, was fortuitously captured on tape by local resident George Holliday, inaugurating what has since become known as citizen journalism. When the analog footage was professionally digitized for its presentation in trial, the officers were accused of assault with a deadly weapon and the use of excessive force. So when the footage was professionally digitized, much of the ferocity directed towards King was selectively removed, thus shifting the effective narrative from a savage attack upon King to a perceived threat of violence towards the officers. By virtue of conducting a frame-by-frame analysis and stripping the video of sound, the jury was spared its visceral violence. An acquittal ensued and riots erupted throughout Los Angeles. All evidence presented in court is subject to a degree of interpretation based upon the framing devices utilized, whether by way of precedent and case law or as a result of testimony furnished by experts and witnesses. However, the deliberate re-editing of the King tape pointed towards a future in which information about what is happening in the visual field would increasingly be subsumed to its datafication, which is to say that the informational value of any given media resides in the capacity of its properties to be metricized, manipulated, and recombined with other data sets to produce new values, and thus the potential to script new narratives. Lawyers defending the actions of the LAPD didn't simply allow the tape to speak for itself at 27.97 frames per second, but arrested its playback, focusing on moments when the blurred and murky electronic capture of violence was of a sufficiently abstract nature to raise uncertainty as to what had seemingly transpired. Abstraction, in this sense, was utilized to open up the image content so that it would recombine with other data sets, specifically the aggregated histories of US race relations and racism, that would in turn permit a technical and ultimately racist reading of the image against representation. But here we arrive at somewhat of a juncture. Despite the continued failure of representation to produce the justice, humanitarian or legal, that images as evidential agents may seek, their very status as disputed objects has also provided the means for redressing wrongs and challenging legal determinations. In my own artwork, I've examined many media artifacts that emerged out of ethnic conflicts, where the presence of material deficiencies becomes a crucial index for registering the violence of living in a conflict zone. And I'll just play a very short clip from a documentary I produced several years ago, which was actually called Material Witness, that deals with two massacres, one in the Srebrenica massacre in Kosovo in 1999, and another massacre in Sri Lanka during the final days of the ethnic conflict there. And I have to warn you, there are some gruesome and graphic images, albeit they're not on the screen for long. So we're jumping into the middle of an hour-long documentary.
Rather than reducing their capacity to stand convincingly as technical witnesses to a crime, the electronic defects of Loshi's massacre tape and the digital artifacts encoded by the anonymous execution video supplement their capacity for testimony. Their impoverished technical production amplifies the radical incomprehensibility of the events they archive. Erratic movement, blurred focus, and dropout made to speak on behalf of those who no longer can.
Yet what is going to happen when contemporary acts of violence, from predictive policing to the execution of a legal drone strike, assume a wholly computational character and no longer generate any of the perceptual contours that would formally allow us to recognize them as image events? While the legal intervention into the Rodney King camcorder footage was to treat its digital archive as data that could be willfully manipulated despite its clearly figurative nature, this now historic moment signals the political stakes that have come to attend the rise of data aesthetics. Abstraction, we could say, has in effect redrawn the topographies of mass violence. Certainly, the operations of data aggregation and machine learning that render information actionable and result in manifold forms of violence is indifferent to the representational forces that might otherwise work to galvanize public opinion or fuel moral indignation, in spite of the fact that there is no guarantee that such empathic attachments will change anything. Reconnecting the causal links that complex, nonlinear informatic events, such as the War on Terror, especially within the American and European campaigns, rely upon as their modus operandi, becomes a much more difficult task when decisions to kill are consistently being taken within the abstractions of bandwidth and code. I say this all the while bearing in mind that the violence embedded in big data and numbers is not to be identified solely with warfare, but works across data infrastructures, from the NSA and GCHQ to the California Gang of Five and asset management monoliths such as BlackRock, to more ordinary practices of credit scoring, biometric sampling, consumer marketing, and health insurance determinations. Numeric data is of course also frequently and expressly used to signal the escalation and gravity of a disaster or a crisis. But even the abstract nature of statistics needs to be translated into intelligible and persuasive formats, something usually achieved when numbers reach a scalar tipping point in triple or quadruple digits. And we've seen these images before. In select instances, numbers can provide the background noise out of which the singularity of an image, such as that of the refugee Aylan Kurdi, the drowned Kurdish Syrian child who washed ashore in Turkey on September 2nd, 2015, can emerge as emblematic or iconic. The representation of the refugee crisis has, in this sense, been much more numeric than visual in character, a literal sea of numbers attended by a growing body count. In response to public anger at the harrowing image of a dead child splashed across the covers of the global press, the German tabloid Bild decided to print a page without an image of Aylan Kurdi as a, quote, tribute to the power of photography. Its editor-in-chief stated, "Without pictures, the world would be more ignorant, the needy even more invisible, more lost. Many crimes would simply be forgotten without visual reminders," he said, pointing to other shocking images that have had an impact on public opinion from Rwanda to Vietnam to Srebrenica. The spaces where photos would have been placed were instead filled by gray boxes and shapes. The cooling thermal image that initiates this presentation offers a powerful example because through it we can access the traumatic dimension of militarized abstraction as a paradoxically ungrounded and private space in which representations can no longer hold fast to the reality effects of war, nor produce their conventional public moral narratives. I say paradoxical because it is, after all, the becoming ground of the figure, the one who bled out on screen, that so disturbs Bryant in his monochromatic and excessive formlessness. He remembers every pixel and is horrified. Every undifferentiated electronic quadrant is a placeholder for a death that was momentarily fully present on screen, but is now ungraspable and unknowable, except as another classified deletion on the kill list. Yet to focus upon Bryant's televisually induced despair is also to grant undue privilege to the subjectivity and sovereign gaze of the perpetrator, whose act of killing is repeated through the technical and visual abolition of the figure into the digital abstraction of the ground. While computational systems are obviously entangled with human actors, machine learning algorithms have evolved capacities to assume many functions that remove us from the chain of decision-making, due in large part to the sheer volume of data that can be scanned and cross-referenced. Assessing the criteria upon which a certain decision was returned by a machine, such as a credit score or the appearance of a name on the kill list, has become incredibly difficult to ascertain for experts and non-specialists alike. As the front lines increasingly move into the covert spaces of computation and digital abstraction, well beyond the thresholds of human perception and their attendant regimes of publicity, our critical vantage points into conditions of conflict must also shift. Screen space has multiplied and refracted the frames of war into a complex field of sensors, software, and servers that track their targets, combatants, capital, and consumers across the electromagnetic spectrum. Investigating digitized and automated forms of contemporary violence will require a conceptual realignment in which we learn to attend to the specificity of struggles that are also working themselves out at the level of processing, from translations between file formats, signal latency, compression artifacts, and data remnants to disclosures of metadata. While cameras and media have long ventured into conflict zones, exposing injustice and documenting violations, the expansion of these zones into powerful computational arrangements must bring about new decoding practices if we are to intervene politically into the electronic fields of weaponized data where algorithms execute and pixels cover up a crime. I would like to end by introducing another thermal image that we've, in fact, already seen some of this material in the previous panel. This time, one produced by Irish artist Richard Moss for his current exhibition in The Curve at the Barbican in London. Using a weapons-grade thermal camera produced in the EU to monitor border traffic, one that can detect the heat signatures of bodies from distances of more than 30 kilometers, Moss has turned its punitive gaze into an aesthetic probe to examine the refugee crisis from up close and at a distance. His project, Incoming, utilizes thermal technology to drain the image of information and intensify its forensic grip on the experiences of refugees arriving by sea or waiting out their days in detention centers. This time, we also see state actors on the ground, raising the makeshift jungle of Calais, rounding up refugees and policing their enclosures. Like all good artworks, the project is not without its problems, as recourse to aesthetic practices for disclosing injustice sometimes seems like a weak form of doing politics. Yet when the thermal camera lingers for many minutes on the everyday activities of daily life in a detention center, we see ordinary people, not would-be terrorists or military targets. Mass uses the thermal camera as a technology of intimacy to generate empathy, unlike Bryant, who can only deploy it to track and kill. In this regard, Mass, who began his career as a photojournalist, is not that far from his roots. It's a return to representation, but with a difference of some 30 kilometers between subject and photographer. And I'd just like to end here with, I'm going to play a clip and a question that this sort of work raises for me, because I think it's quite a powerful work to experience. And this would be my question, is our only recourse to justice to humanize the pixel, to heighten our sense of ethical resolution so that the data body doesn't simply disappear into the informatic unknown? I'm really not sure that this strategy is going to actually attend to the problematics of representation within the rise of data aesthetics or data abstraction and machine learning. So I have no good answer to the kind of question that I'd like to end on. I will play just a very short clip from the incoming as a different clip, so we'll also see the way that Moss is trying to kind of use, even in this project, there's a lot of shots of details where he's also trying to develop or work with a certain sort of, let's say, a certain kind of level of aesthetic abstraction, even insofar as this technology can actually produce a very kind of detailed and sort of forensic look on things. So let me just play this.
This thermal camera, which is produced in the European Union by a multinational weapons company, can detect body heat from a distance of 30.3 kilometers, day or night. This powerful military tool was not designed for storytelling and was never intended to be used aesthetically. I used this military-grade camera designed for battlefield awareness and long-range border surveillance in an attempt to engage and confront the ways in which our governments represent and therefore regard the refugee. We wanted to use the technology against itself to create an immersive humanist art form, allowing the viewer to meditate on the profoundly difficult and frequently tragic journeys of refugees through the metaphors of hypothermia, global warming, border enforcement, mortality, and what the philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called the bare life of stateless people.
So I'm just going to leave it there, and hopefully there's enough material for us to have a lively discussion. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Is that close enough? Or you